et aussi de vous féliciter parce que c'est votre fête nationale aujourd'hui, la fête nationale du Sénégal. Donc, on vous remercie d'avoir pris le temps de venir ici. Vous particulièrement, Mayacine Camara, que je connais depuis très longtemps. Donc, un plaisir de vous revoir. Les commissaires de l'Union africaine, tous nos frères et sœurs de la Banque africaine de développement avec qui on travaille très étroitement. J'aimerais aussi dire bonjour et remercier ma sœur, l'ambassadeur Tadesse de l'Éthiopie. Comme vous avez si bien dit, nous remercions le gouvernement d'Éthiopie en entrée pour tout ce qu'ils ont fait, toutes les dispositions qui ont été mises en place pour assurer que cette réunion se passe d'une façon étroite. Distingués délégués, Mesdames, Messieurs, it is my honor to welcome you all to Addis, the diplomatic capital of Africa, for the 51st session of the Conference of African Ministers of Finance, Planning and Economic Development on the theme African Continental Free Trade Area and Fiscal Space for Jobs and Economic Diversification. Let me take this opportunity to welcome amidst us the representative, again, of the government of Ethiopia and the people of Ethiopia for their continued hospitality and support for hosting this conference. If the Minister of Energy was here, he would tell you to also visit Ethiopia before you leave, because Ethiopia is a beautiful country, so I'm going to do it on his behalf. This 2018 Conference of Ministers is opportune, and its theme could not be more timely and appropriate, as Mr. Kamara has said. On the 21st of March 2018, Africa made history by signing the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which ushers in a new era of promise and provides a historic opportunity for the continent to unleash its development potential. The agreement was signed at the 10th Extraordinary Summit of the African Union Heads of States and Government by 44 African Union member states. A further 6 African Union member states signed the Kigali Declaration, committing to sign the African Continental Free Trade Area following the finalization of domestic review processes. The Economic Commission for Africa sees this agreement as an instrument to reposition the African continent as a competitive player in the global arena. However, to realize the promise of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement and achieve its development goals, the continent must take bold actions on many fronts. The most important and urgent action is to create the fiscal space needed to foster both public and private investment while ensuring economic diversification with a view to creating jobs. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, now we must seize the momentum at hand to focus on how to operationalize the agreement in a manner that realizes its potential to the benefit of the average African. Our collective market potential cannot be underestimated as incomes rise and the middle class continues to grow. Household spending is expected to grow at 3.9% per annum to reach $2.1 trillion. Corporate spending is expected to reach $3.5 trillion by 2025 as well. Taking the opportunities created by the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, this is an opportunity for corporate Africa to leverage these expansions and boost economic growth. Through implementation of the African CFTA, we can generate the kind of growth that can support economic diversification, industrialization, and meet Agenda 2063 and Africa we want for all of us. Manufactured products make up 46% of intra-Africa trade, and only 22% of Africa's trade with the rest of the world. So boosting intra-African trade through the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is likely to support the continent's industrialization. Indeed, according to our estimates, the African CFTA will increase Africa's industrial exports by over 50% by 2022. The agreement can also help to promote the type of business and trade that benefits small and medium enterprises, women and the youth, which account for about 80% of the region's businesses. Nevertheless, the African CFTA also has implications for our fiscal policies in Africa. Some might be concerned that the CFTA would lead to losses of tariff revenues, and this will create holes in national budgets. But in fact, the impact of the agreement on fiscal revenues is likely to be minimal. This is for several reasons. Amongst others, first, intra-African trade is only a small share of Africa's total trade, as we've said before. Most of intra-African trade is barely liberalized under the regional economic community's free trade agreements. Therefore, the CFTA is likely to affect only about 7% of Africa's total imports under current patterns. Second, countries will be allowed to exclude a certain number of tariff lines from liberalization. As intra-African trade tends to be highly concentrated in a small number of tariff lines, it may be possible for countries to exclude large shares of tariff lines that are important for raising tariff revenue if they need to do so. As a result, tariff revenue losses will be limited Given the small size of these losses, it will be important not to make the exclusions too large, as this may risk undermining the economic benefits of the CFTA. Third, tariff revenues are not the largest source of government revenue for African countries. They account for only 15% of total tax revenue in Africa. Finally, tariff reductions in the CFTA are to be phased in gradually over a period of 5 years for developing countries and 10 years for least developed countries, or 10 to 13 years respectively for sensitive products. Fourth, these tariff revenue losses may be outweighed by the additional revenues from growth to be generated by the CFTA. In particular, as outlined in the issues paper for this conference, the CFTA is expected to increase GDP by between 1 to 6%, which should broaden the tax base, boost revenue collection. What is more, these estimates are likely to substantially underestimate the economic benefits of the CFTA, as they do not take into account the impact of liberalization in services and investment. Initial modeling of the impacts of services liberalization under the CFTA, for example, suggests that it will produce significant additional economic gains. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, the CFTA should also prompt us to discuss broader reforms which will create more fiscal space on the continent. After all, the CFTA would lead each country to examine exactly what it means for their public revenues, whether any changes are needed, and especially how to make the most of the CFTA. We will need to implement complementary policies, such as those outlined in the Action Plan for Boosting Intra-Africa Trade. But we should carry out a broader review of our macroeconomic policies, focusing on fiscal policy and whether it will be fit for purpose to help us not only to adapt, but to make the most of the CFTA. Most of the resources needed for these investments for the CFTA will be mobilized within the continent through fiscal policy. While private finance will play a role, there is a limited extent to which private sector can be leveraged to fund public investments required to realize the SDGs and Agenda 2063. So we hope that with the CFTA, the governments will be able to increase their revenues, focus more on public sector investments, education, and health, while we crowd in a private sector that comes to Africa in search of bigger and larger markets. We need to improve our levels of fiscal space, even to take better advantage of the CFTA. Because as part of taking advantage of the CFTA, we're going to need to improve our infrastructure, our energy, our logistics. And for this, we need additional revenues. We are going to need to tackle issues of illicit financial flows. We're going to need to expand the tax base. The CFTA in itself is meant to increase production and diversify our economies. And this process should help us enlarge and expand the tax base as we go about it. As we tackle issues of profit-shifting activities from multinational corporations, which have been estimated to cost Africa at least 2% of GDP in foregone tax revenues, we will also be helping foster the CFTA. So as you see, ladies and gentlemen, the CFTA is all-encompassing. It is an important part of fiscal policy, and that is why we decided as the ECA today to take a look at how the CFTA and trade can fit into the overall discussions. We thought bringing in the ministries of finance, the economic ministers, as Mr. Kamara, the chair, said, will be important, both to understand the macro dimensions and the trade implications of the CFTA, but also the micro dimensions of removing border controls and working towards a faster and more efficient union. All prescriptions of pro-cyclical or counter-cyclical policies are no longer a remedy for the continent to grow. As the rest of the world wonders about the benefits of trade, I think Africa, in signing the CFTA, has resolutely said it believes that trade is a means and a vehicle for development and for inclusive growth. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, even before the CFTA, recent growth trajectories across the continent was already promising. In 2017, Africa recorded a growth rate of 3.1%, up from 1.6%. Growth is forecast to get to about 3.9% in 2018 and stay the same in 2019. These trends are underpinned by sustained improvement in macroeconomic management and good economic governance, as well as increasing trade and investment ties within Africa and with other emerging economies. A big challenge, which is also an opportunity, is that Africa's growth remains low relative to its potential. While some countries attain double-digit growth, such as the ones that we're sitting in today, have been doing for a long time and growing at 8%, many other countries are not doing as well. And we believe that to get to the 8% growth that is experienced in Ethiopia, we will need higher levels of investment. About 21.4% of GDP of investment will be needed to speed up economic diversification and enhance our global competitiveness. The CFTA allows us to do that by ensuring that Africa can begin to trade with itself, because we know that when Africa trades with itself, Africa trades more value-added goods, and the process of technological transfer, learning, and innovation is faster. This is why we believe that the CFTA is a fundamental piece, not only of Africa's integration, but of Africa's economic growth and of job creation for the youth. Aggregate manufacturing output in between 2009 and 2016, in absolute terms, contributes only 18% of value added to the economy today. Although showing some signs of industrialization and structural transformation, this performance calls for urgent action by African countries to diversify their economy. Economic transformation is the only sure way to accelerate job creation in the face of slow progress towards the continent's social development goals, coupled with huge demographic pressures in some regions of Africa. Notwithstanding the improvements of the working class, we still see Africa as a continent that has 49% of its population living below the poverty line. In 2014, 60% of Africa's working population was trapped in vulnerable jobs, while in 2015, 1 in 3 workers in West, East, Central, and Southern Africa lived in extreme poverty. The youth, particularly women, bear the brunt of poverty and unemployment, and most importantly, of vulnerability, and are more likely to migrate or seek alternative means of survival. These trends suggest that the continent's demographic profile could very well pose a serious challenge as opposed to a dividend if we do not take advantage of the benefits of the Continental Free Trade Agreement, which would allow us to produce goods that we can sell to each other and which require initially lower levels of investment. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it is no secret that accelerating inclusive growth and economic diversification hinges crucially on the ability of the continent to mobilize and effectively use its domestic resources to expand the regional market. Lately, we have witnessed an increase in the cost of external borrowing, and our expectation is that this trend will continue. Therefore, an even more urgent need for increasing our domestic resources. As our economies continue to diversify, as our policies continue to improve, we believe that the CFTA is just one more anchor to improving the overall well-being and prosperity of the Africans. I cannot end this presentation without stopping to congratulate Kenya and Ghana for being the first countries that yesterday ratified the Continental Free Trade Agreement. I think so. He just said next will be Senegal. I think that shows the zeal and the ambition of the continent, because after the signing in Kigali, there was a discussion around how soon and how quickly will countries ratify. And it was a pleasure yesterday to see that it's not only that countries are ratifying, but there is a race to ratification. Countries want to be the first, countries want to be among the top 10. We still have 8 spots going. So we hope that by the time we get to Mauritania, we will have an important number. And by the time we come back to Addis next year in January, the 22 countries that are needed for ratification would have signed and ratified the CFTA, and all the discussions that we will be having over the next 2 or 3 days to ensure that the CFTA helps us produce growth, inclusive growth, prosperity for the continent, and injects Africa as a continent into the global economy as it deserves, will produce fruitful results and fruitful policy guidance for our ministers when they come on Monday. Once again, and in conclusion, let me emphasize that the CFTA promises to be one of the greatest steps forward to comprehensive and holistic integration that the continent has ever seen. We need to make sure that we have the fiscal resources and the space to make the most of it, and the ECA remains a committed and trusted partner in this process. I thank you for your kind attention.